Hello and welcome to my channel. I'm Angela Brennan and today I'm bringing you Spellbinders Stencil of the Month September 2024 Colorful Pumpkins. This has got 5 layering stencils that you can create a background of beautiful pumpkins. I place a card in the corner of the stamp wheel, which is a sticky mat, and then I place and tape the first stencil on. I'm using the Altenew Jewel Tones ink set. So I start with Tanzanite and I'm trying to put a little bit a darker shade at the bottom of the pumpkin just to give it a bit of a shadow. I try not to do too much with these pumpkins but just put one darker shade because I'm going to use only one color per layer. Once I'm done with that, I remove that stencil layer and I'm going to put the next stencil layer. These stencils have got a mark in the corner, a registration mark on the front side of the stencil. Now to ensure I'm putting it the right way up, later on as I'm more familiar with the stencil, I put a dot with my Sharpie marker in the right hand corner so I know which way up it is. The next color here I'm using is Rhodolite. I feel these jewel tone colors are quite muted and therefore would blend well with what I would think of as autumnal colors. You don't quite see blue in autumnal colors, but I think it's muted enough to make that foray into the autumnal colors. Now I'm going with a third stencil and I'm going to be using red jasper. The red and rhodolite or burgundy color is ideal for autumnal colors. I'm using a small blending brush from Altenew as well. I've got one blending brush for each color family, and when I'm going to the lighter colors, all I do is I take the blending brush and I rub it against a damp stamp chamois and then a dry cloth, and it's ready to take on the next color. So that's how I use these blending brushes by color family. Unlike my distress inks and distress oxide inks, I have one foam pad for each color. Now I'm on the 4th stencil and this will finish off all of the pumpkins on the card front. The last stencil is just the stems. So some of the layers or the backgrounds that I do, I've used some paste. I could have used a paste for the stems, but this one, what I ended up doing is I used another color, which I think is a green opal from the same jewel tone set. For this, I use a smaller brush because it's a very tiny space. I'm going to be using the Altenew Detailed blending brush so that it can get the color into those stems. The stencils fit really well to fill up the entire front of an A2 card front. So once I'm done with this, and these inks dry really fast because they're dye inks, I can just cut it out with an A2 die and put it onto a card front. I use the Spellbinders Precision Layering A2 Air die set to die cut it to put it onto the A2 card front. Here I've used the Luxe collection from Catherine Pooler inks to stencil on the pumpkins with the first 4 stencils. For the final stencil, which is the stems, I'm going to be using the Lunar paste Fake Plant. I use a spatula to put the paste onto each of the areas where you've got the stem. It's easy enough to put it, but try not to put too much because it can seep under the stencil and make a mess. So these paste needs to be left to dry at least for an hour. However, if you put too thick a layer, you might want to leave it for 2 hours. But I've put a thin layer here and I'll just leave it aside. I clean the stencil immediately so the paste doesn't harden onto the stencil and ruin it. Or you could just soak it into a basin of soapy water. It dries beautifully and there's the tiniest bit of dimension once it dries. I don't put it through the die cutting machine with an A2 die because I was afraid the dimension would get flattened. But latterly I realized it doesn't. So for this one, I just used my guillotine and cut it to fit onto the front of an A2 card. I attach it to the A2 card with double-sided tape, and that's the card front done. All you need is a simple sentiment and you have a beautiful completed card. As the Spellbinders club kits abide by a theme, I choose the sentiment from another club kit. I think for this card I've chosen the sentiment from the Better Press of the month. Here I'm using the same color on a craft card for the first 4 layers of the stencil that has got the pumpkin image. I'm using the EO Arts Unicorn Pigment ink, which is a white ink, Because it's a pigment ink, it doesn't dry. The ink doesn't dry very fast. Thus, I'm applying ink onto the first 4 layers of the stencils rather quickly so the ink doesn't dry too much, because I'm going to sprinkle some clear embossing powder and melt that embossing powder with my heat tool. Thus, there will be a shine, and also it doesn't give a chance for the ink, pigment ink, to smudge. For the final layer, which is the stems of the pumpkin, I'm going to apply some glimmer paste. I hope you find this video informative and enjoy the video. If you do, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And when you do subscribe, remember to press that notification bell so you're alerted when new videos are uploaded. I've got all the products I use, as far as I can remember, listed in the description below. However, if you see something I use in the video that I've not listed, do leave me a comment and I'll try and get back to you as fast as I can. I do lots of Spellbinders Clubkits videos, and what I do once month is over, once all the videos for the month is over, I put it into a playlist so it's easy for reference when you want to check out a particular Clubkit for that month. I know sometimes it's hard to get to the Clubkits before the month is over because of other commitments. Here I'm applying the Nuvo Glimmer Paste Gold Glitterati or Glitterati Gold onto the stems. I'm using the same spatula and I'm going to apply it to each of those little stems. I like doing it for the stems, but I do show later on how I do the glimmer paste, or rather the Nuvo paste and some glimmer paste for the entire 5 stencils. Now that takes a little bit time and patience because you need to wait for the paste to dry between each layer. And believe me, I do get impatient and make quite a bit of a mess, but I do get there eventually. I do put this aside to dry. Again, I think 1 hour, especially if it's just a stem, is pretty safe. I just wanted to use a muted color. I didn't want to use green because I thought it'll go with the background of that craft background card. The sentiment, "You're such a blessing," comes from the clear stamp of the month. I just stamped it Versamark ink, sprinkled some white embossing powder, heat embossed it, and used the coordinating die to die cut it. I die cut a few layers to give it a bit of dimension on the card front. The sentiment "Thanks for lending a hand" comes from the Glimmer of the Month September 2024 Friendly Thanks. I put the big thanks on the card front and I put "for lending a hand" inside the card. I could put both of it on the card front, and I do it for other club kits, but I didn't want to cover too much of the beautiful pumpkins. For the cards I do in this video with the stencil of the month, I do use quite a few sentiments from all the other Spellbinders club kits. I used the clear stamp of the month earlier. This is the Glimmer of the Month, and I also do use sentiments from the Better Press of the month. Here is the first stencil I did with the Alter-New Jewel Tone inks. After doing that, I decided to use some paste onto the blue bit. That particular stencil, I'm using the Glimmer Paste Galactica Blue. I just thought it would be nice to have a little bit of shimmer. Not a lot, but just use it on the pumpkin instead of the stems all the time. So I'm just going to use it on one stencil. So one layer, which is the blue layer, I'm going to use the Galactica Blue Glimmer Paste. The thing is, after you've done your inking, if you don't like the colors, you can always put a paste on top of it, or you can even add a different ink color onto it and just create a different color. So you can be quite versatile with these stencils because you can put it back in place and cover it with a different color if you're not happy with what's turned out once it's dry. So again, I'm going to leave this aside to dry for about an hour or two because it's quite a large area that I've done some paste on. And there you go. You can see the nice shine and glitter, and I think it looks really, really pretty. For this card, I'm going to be using the Better Press of the Month for the sentiment, and this is a sentiment that I did some hot foiling previously. I love hot foiling with my Better Press plates because why not? Because you get a 2-for-1. I've got quite a few options here. When I get my hot foiling machine started, I do quite a bit of it. Especially for these sentiments, you can use a lot of your scrap hot foils and go to town with hot foiling. And it's a simple sentiment on the card front, and there you go, a beautiful elegant card. I can't see how simple it is to make lovely cards with this stencil set because the card front is covered. For this card, I'm using paste for all layers of the stencil. I want to use Lunar paste for all layers, but I think I don't have a red Lunar paste, so I used some glimmer paste as well. The thing about doing this type of stenciling is you need to be patient. Firstly, you need to make sure you don't paste too much of the paste and let it seep under the stencil. If not, after doing 3 layers, you could ruin it. You need to leave it aside each layer for 2 hours to dry, and then you come back and do the next layer. Leave it for another 2 hours and let it dry. So it does take patience, and in between you could end up messing it up by smearing and putting too much of a paste, and I do that, I'm afraid, but I just persevere. I really wanted a full stencil with just the paste, so you can see I made a bit of a mess there and I redid that one. So it does take patience to get this done. I do like Lunar paste. I need to get more of them. I don't have enough colors. I think I've only got half a dozen colors, and I don't have a red amongst them, which is why I use a Nuvo paste or glimmer paste for the red. I think you need to press the stencil where you're going to apply the paste so it doesn't go underneath the stencil. You've got to be really careful when you do the stenciling, especially when you're doing it for all layers, and you've put in a lot of effort in letting it dry 2 hours for each layer. And this is the final layer for the pumpkin where I'm using the glimmer paste. I just think that if you get the hang of applying the paste carefully, you can get a nice dimensional paste card front. I do like how this card turned out. Every time I remove the stencil, I'm holding my breath to see whether I've made a mess with it. And now for the final layer, I applied the Lunar paste fake plant with the spatula. So this is the final layer, and I'm very carefully applying the paste onto each of those open stem areas so I don't mess it up. It's going to be really painful if I mess it up at this stage after hours of getting each of those other layers to dry. I do like how it turned out in the end. I do make a couple of cards each time. I think I did 3 layers each time I did this, because if I'm going to do it once and wait for it, I did, and some of it I did mess up. So I did have some of the cards I did where there was too much and it made a bit of a smudge. And what I did for some of them is I used parts of it. As you'll see in one of the cards, I die cut the good part of it and used it on a card. Here what I'm doing is I'm going to be putting a die cut of a circle to create a bit of a shaker card. I use both the circle. I used the circle in fact in another card so it's not wasted, but I thought I wanted to create a shaker card with this card front, and I'm going to be using the clear stamp of the month for the sentiment. It's a pretty straightforward shaker card, nothing too difficult about it. I wanted to try and do a slightly different card front rather than just have the stencil, hence the shaker element introduced. I'm applying some glossy accents onto the pumpkin die cut just to give it a little bit of shine and some dimension. This is one of the stenciled items where I use all the Lunar paste and the glimmer paste. So there's a bit of smudges towards the end. Rather than waste the whole thing, I'm using a notched corner frame to die cut just the good bits, the bits that did not get smudged. And I'm going to layer it up with some gold card and place it onto a card front. So rather than just place it onto a card front, I'm going to do some embossing with my 3D embossing folder of the month, September 24 pumpkin patch. Per usual, before embossing, I spritz some water so that the card doesn't crack, and I place some heavy objects on it so it dries flat and does not warp. After die cutting it, I realized I did not complete this. I forgot to do the stems. So I'm just putting it back into my MISTI, taping it up, and going to just put some Lunar paste, with green Lunar paste, just to cover the stems for that bit of the die cut. Easily forgotten. I get so into getting all of the layers done, I totally forgot this. And I'm glad I realized it before I put it onto the card. I suppose I could have always drawn the stems with a marker or a Copic marker if I'd put it onto the card already. There's always a way around some of the unfortunate mistakes you make when you're creating a card. Card creation is not a linear approach. Sometimes you've got to take some different approaches to get the results that you want. Not only do I have to clean my stencil immediately, but I also clean the surfaces where all the paste touches. If not, it'll harden and spoil that surface. So here is the 3D embossed background that I'm going to use on the card panel. So I'm attached it to the card base. Per usual, I always emboss something slightly bigger, so it's easier to put down onto the card base and just cut the excess off, so that the embossed panel is nice and flush against the corners of the card base. I attached the first layer with some double-sided tape. I've been asked why I use double-sided tape and not liquid glue when I put the layers on. I just like it. I think it's neater. I don't like using liquid glue when I put layers against a panel. I use the die cut of the outer layer of the stencil panel as a guide to place the panel that I want to place in the middle of the gold base or gold mat, so it's nice and centralized. And I've used some dimensional tape to give it a little bit of a pop. I'm using the clear stamp for the mum to stamp the sentiment, a harvest of love to you and yours, and I'm going to be using my MISTI to do it. I place the sentiments onto the card, pick up the stamps with my stamping platform door or the MISTI's door, and then I'm going to make sure that I use the stamp conditioning eraser to remove the sheen on top of the stamp, especially when they're new stamps. It's good to remove the sheen on the stamp so it will hold on to the ink to facilitate stamping a nice and sharp image. I'm using some anti-static powder because I'm going to do some heat embossing. And then here's the VersaFine Clair medieval blue color that I'm using to stamp it. I use a stamp press tool to have an even pressure onto the stamp, and I do it twice. This is a pigment ink, therefore it'll remain wet a little while. I sprinkle some clear fine embossing powder a couple of times to make sure it's well covered, and I use my heat embossing tool to melt the embossing powder. I use a wooden peg because it's quite a small card and I don't want to burn my finger, so it's a bit of an extension there, just to keep my finger safe. Once I've stamped the sentiment, I'm going to use the die that comes with the clear stamp of the month. So the clear stamp of the month comes with a set of coordinating die sets, and that's the die that I'm using here to die cut the sentiment. I die cut a few additional sentiments because I would like to layer it. I usually put 2 or 3 layers behind the sentiment so that when I add it onto the card front, there's a little bit of dimension. And usually I do this using a liquid glue, so it gives me a little bit of time to make sure it's in the right space. I use a T-ruler to make sure I place the sentiments onto the card front in a straight line. Now, if you don't want to place a straight line, obviously you can, but you don't want to mess up your card towards the end by not placing it nice and straight. And a T-ruler is really handy to do that. And here's a lovely simple card. And don't let a smudge in the corner of the stenciling ruin it. Here is a stenciling that I did with Altenew Crisp dye ink sets. I used 4 different ink sets and did a little bit of shadow with it as well. Once I've done that, I decide to use the Glimmer of the Month sentiment. It's a big fangs that I'm going to put onto the front of the card. I start off by taping it with some Best Ever Crafted because I want to anchor it in the right place, and I'm using polished brass hot foil. Now I'm going to do 2 hot foilings because I want to have a bit of a dual hot foiling here. So you'll see what I mean. So you can hot foil on inked or ink blended stenciled surfaces, and it just does it as beautifully. The usual, I'm doing a medium setting, about 24 seconds on my Gemini foil press, and I'll put it through the Gemini Junior die cutting and embossing machine, and I'm going to get some amazing results immediately. So I feel that it doesn't really stand out with just the gold. So what I do is I'm going to put a slight shadow, what I call shadow, or just offset the thanks slightly, ever so slightly, and I'm going to use the black hot foil. So it's going to have a bit of the black hot foil with the gold as the shadow. I like the way it turned out because it makes the sentiment pop beautifully. So you can hot foil onto ink blended surfaces, and you can hot foil on another hot foil as well. And this way the thanks sentiment stands out quite boldly and pops. The slight overfoiling near the hedge, the curve of the hedge, I just use a soft eraser and rub it out and it comes off. So for the inside of the card, I decide to do another sentiment. Thanks, you have a big heart. So I'm going to do hot foil the insert. So I do that separately, and I'm using a lot of my scrap hot foils for this. I have a box of scrap hot foils, and this is perfect to use it all up, so you don't have to constantly be cutting out from your hot foil tubes. I like the idea of hot foiling for the sentiment for the inside of the card, and you get some really nice classy look. Thanks for having a big heart, and there you go. That's the card done. I used the Precision Layer A2A die set to cut a nice perfect A2 size that's going to go onto the front of an A2 card. An A2 card measures 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. It fits perfectly, and that's the card done. I like this card. I like the elegance of this card, and I certainly like all the cards I've created, and I hope you do too. Look at that shine. I managed to do lots of stenciling with various different colors, and I used the sentiments from all the different sets within the Spellbinders Clubkits from September 2024. I really hope you've enjoyed the video and found lots of inspiration. If you have, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And remember to check out the playlist that's going to come out with all the many videos that I've done to showcase the different ways you can use the Spellbinders Clubkits from September 2024. I love the shine and subtle dimension on this card that's been wholly done with glimmer paste and lunar paste. I think it takes a little bit of effort and patience, but I just love it. So here's the circle that I used, and this little blue pumpkins is from another set I did where I smudged the orange one, so I just used the blue. I've done a few of the pastes with the stencils, and some of it got smudged. In stenciling these cards with the paste, I certainly learned how to control the amount of paste I put when stenciling. It's a good skill to have, especially when I like using the paste, and definitely use it for future cards. Here's a close-up of all the cards that I've created. I really hope it inspires you, and when you get your Spellbinders Clubkits delivered, you start creating beautiful cards. Not hard to do, and I've got a whole bunch of thank you cards that I can use going forward. Happy crafting, and I'll catch you in my next video. Take care.